There are things a man can bury deep and hope that time will erase. The sting of the first whiskey, the lowering of a friend's face into the earth, even the ring of a wife's laughter off a kitchen window. But there are certain things a man can never shake. The feel of a child dying in his arms. For Jeb Carter, that memory had a name. Lily, his little girl. Only 8 years old when fever took her in 2 nights. He had battled wars, weathered battles, outlived comrades. But he couldn't save her. And when she was dead, so was he. Not dead, but empty. He quit Kansas with no map, no mission. Just a man fleeing the specter of a cough he couldn't stifle. His horse bore him west into Arizona, into a quieter desert than his own heart. But on a typical day, the desert presented him with something he wasn't expecting. And what he saw brought his horse to a halt. Under a mesquite tree split down the middle sat a figure. Not a beast, not quite human in the way she sat. A girl. Standing, wrists tied behind her back, head bent under the weight of a burlap bag. Like someone had attempted to scrub her from the universe. She didn't shriek. She didn't weep. She just whispered, "Please, don't remove it." No terror in her tone, only an ache deep in her bones. Like she'd said those 2 words 100 times previously, and no one had heard. Jeb didn't hesitate. He didn't respond. He merely stood there, desert wind blowing dust against his feet. It was like standing over a grave that remained unfilled. Then he knelt. His hand closed around the sack. She jerked, but didn't fight. And when he pulled it loose, what he saw hurt more than any blade. Her face was scarred on one side, her skin ripped in places, one eye bruised purple, the other sunken, staring. But it wasn't her injuries that broke him. It was her expression. Not fear, not even pain. Just the look of someone who already knew the world would never see her again. And never care. Inside, she would not eat, would not drink, and yanked that sack back over her head like armor. She sat coiled in a corner, knees to chest, as if the walls were still closing in on her. Jeb didn't struggle with her. He just left food on the table, went outside, and split wood under the fading sun. But when he came back, the bowl was clean. The next day the bread was gone. Then beans. Then coffee. Small things. Not quite enough to be called trust, but just enough to be called hope. By the 3rd evening, Jeb spread his worn army coat close to her corner. In the morning, it lay over her legs. She still wrapped the sack about her, but her shoulders were a little less slumped, her breaths a little easier. To everyone else, those things were meaningless. To Jeb, a man who had watched too many throw in the towel, they meant the world. Because she wasn't giving up yet. And when her eyes finally did meet his, for just an instant, even with that bag still on, he knew. She was still resisting. But the silence doesn't last forever. And Jeb knew one thing for sure. If she didn't talk soon, the truth would catch up with them on its own. And the truth, when it arrives, always slices deeper than scars. By the 5th day, words at last dripped out of her like water seeping through rock. She breathed her stepfather's name, James Craig. She wasn't questioned. She just said it while peeling potatoes, steady voice, shaking hands. And then, fragment by fragment, the tale poured out. Her mom died. James called her cursed. Told the mark on her cheek was punishment. Locked her up, beat her, and when that wasn't enough, worse came. One day she got away, but the town didn't question. They didn't care. They called her a witch, and they lit the matches. There are certain things a man can allow to slip away from his memory. The sting of his first whiskey. The dead man's name of a comrade lost all those years ago. Even the laughter of his wife coming through the kitchen window. But there are other things. Things that never fade. Such as the mass of a child dying in his arms. Jeb Carter bore that burden. Her name was Lily. Only 8 years old when fever claimed her in 2 nights' time. He'd been a soldier, a survivor. But he hadn't been a savior. Once she died, he left Kansas behind. Rode west with no map, no plan, just fleeing from the sound of her wheezing until he found himself in the dry quiet of Arizona. Alone. Empty. But on an ordinary day, something halted his horse under a split mesquite tree. He thought it was nothing at first. Then he saw her. Someone moving, but not quite right. Not animal, not quite human. A girl, sitting upright with her hands tied and a burlap bag over her face. She did not scream, did not struggle, only spoken in a whisper. Please, don't remove the sack. Not in fear, but in a bone-weary weariness, as though she'd uttered those words 1,000 times and no one had ever heard her. Jeb slowly knelt, sending dust puffing at his boots. She winced but didn't deter him when he lifted the sack away. What he saw underneath caused his chest to hurt. Her face was bruised, ripped, swollen. One eye purple, the other wide and empty. But it wasn't the hurt that cut deepest. It was the expression. Not fear, not pain. Just the resignation of someone who no longer thought anyone would care to look at her at all. And in that instant, Jeb felt something stir inside. Because what the world had discarded, he wasn't going to discard himself. She didn't say anything on the ride to his cabin. He didn't push. Silence sometimes heals wounds better than questions. His cabin was set along a dried creek bed, out of the way of the world. There, he presented her with bread and water. His cabin was set along a dried creek bed, out of the way of the world. There, he presented her with bread and water. She turned them down. All she did was sit in the corner, sack over her head, knees pulled into her chest as though the walls were closing in on her. Jeb didn't protest. He simply left a bowl of food within reach and went outside to chop wood. By evening, the bowl was bare. The next evening, the same. By the third evening, she had drawn his old army coat over her legs for heat. Little signs, not trust yet, but hope. By the fifth day, her voice emerged. Soft at first, calm like a stream breaking dry stone. She uttered a name, James Craig, her stepfather, and with it, she poured out the venom of her tale. How, upon her mother's death, James called her cursed. Told her that her scars were punishment. He locked her up, beat her, and did worse. When she fled, the town accused her of being a witch and lit up the torches. Jeb said nothing. He merely listened. But deep inside, something deadly awakened within him. The following morning, he informed Annie. That was what her name was, that he was going to Tombstone for provisions. She nodded and continued chopping wood. But Tombstone had its own darkness. At the general store, Jeb heard two men joking about a devil-faced girl up in the hills, said the old man with her likely paid silver just to touch her. Jeb put down his basket, went over, and when he departed, the bag of oats they rested against contained more blood than grain. No one stopped him. No one said a word. He bought his bread and rode home, knuckles bruised. Annie asked not, but when she saw them, she held a cold cloth to them in silence. Justice isn't always words. It's the silence that comes after the crack of a jaw. But calculation wasn't finished. One night, while chopping wood, Jeb heard it. A high whistle. Not the wind. Not a bird. A summons. 3 riders crested the ridge, guns down, faces unyielding. Jeb asked them if they had papers. They laughed. One walked forward, hand jerking at his belt. Before he could take a step, the racking sound of a shotgun came from the cabin. Annie stood in the doorway, barefoot, the old double barrel held firmly in her hand. The man halted. Jeb moved forward, took his wrist, twisted until he went to his knees, leaned over and whispered something no one but Annie could hear. The rest of the riders turned and rode off in silence. The man rose slowly, pride shattered, and didn't look back. That evening, Annie sat beside the window with the shotgun in her lap. Jeb never said to stop. Occasionally survival is about reminding the world you can still recall how. The following morning, Jeb brewed 2 coffees. One black and bitter. One sweetened with honey, just the way Annie preferred it. She hadn't said anything, but he'd caught on. For the first time in years, he sat out on the porch with someone sitting next to him. The wind still.
No dust. No danger.
Only tranquility. Annie had taken the sack away for good the previous night. Her scars still stayed, but her eyes had altered. They no longer begged. They saw. And for the first time since Lily, Jeb allowed himself to believe. Not everything lost is lost forever. He gave Annie a shovel at noon. Together, they put in tomatoes in the backyard. Not because they were hungry, but because sometimes it feels right to make something grow. Some people believe love is roses and ballads. But sometimes, love is a still garden, plowed with bruised hands, watered with habit, grown in silence. And perhaps that's enough. So I want to ask you this: what would it take for you to look at someone, not for who the world instructed them to be, but for who they perhaps still could be? And if this story resonated with you, if it sparked even a tiny bit of hope within you, then press that like button. Subscribe for more, because out here in the dust and quiet of the West, not every story concludes in flames.